Closing arguments. Listen, we didn't pick him up at the witness store. He wouldn't have been our choice. He was the choice of the former president to be his fixer and his lawyer.
And they made the point that that's exactly why Donald Trump hired him in the first place, because he was somebody, the prosecution argued, who would lie on Donald Trump's behalf, who would do anything on Donald Trump's behalf. Such was his loyalty to Trump. Cohen once famously said that he would be willing to take a bullet for Donald Trump. But when the prosecutors started honing in on Michael Cohen and on these hush money payments, it was Michael Cohen who was actually prosecuted first, not entirely for what happened with Stormy Daniels, but in part for what happened with these payments to Stormy Daniels. And Michael Cohen served time in a federal penitentiary long before Donald Trump was ever indicted for anything. Michael Cohen, who I believe the evidence is quite strong, believed he deserved a pardon from Donald Trump, never got that pardon from Donald Trump. And when Michael Cohen was prosecuted.
First at 5, guilty on all 34 counts.
Yeah, we're continuing to monitor ABC News' coverage, but the jury convicting former President Donald Trump about an hour ago in the New York hush money trial.
Now, he has become now the first former president convicted of felony crimes. It was a unanimous decision, the jury finding him guilty of falsifying business records. The trial stemming from a hush money payment his lawyer at the time made to a porn star, and how that information was entered into the Trump company books.
The jury began deliberations yesterday. This morning, they came back to court with questions for the judge about testimony and charges. They wanted some of that testimony reread to them. But word came down just before 4 o'clock San Antonio time that the jury had reached that verdict.
Shortly after the verdict was announced, former President Donald Trump spoke to the media that was waiting outside the courtroom.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a so-respect DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
That the full statement from former President Donald Trump. So far, the prosecutor in this case, Alvin Bragg, has not spoken. We're anticipating that he will be briefing the media later tonight.
Yeah, I also want to point out that there were a lot of accusations that the president made there, a lot of those unfounded, and that this jury was a jury that both his team and the prosecution picked. So we're going to rejoin ABC News coverage of this historic decision. Expect to hear from the prosecution soon.
Minutes. I'll actually start a few minutes before that, which is when the judge called all the parties back to the courtroom at around 4:15. The jury was to deliberate until 4:30, and the judge told both sides he was going to let the jury go at 4:30, and then he left the bench. And over the next few minutes, Donald Trump was positively giddy with laughter with his lead attorney, Todd Blanche. They were laughing pretty heavily at the defense table, and really all smiles. They seemed very relaxed. And it was really only a few minutes after that that the jury sent this note saying they had a verdict. So when they did enter, I think you heard Olivia Rubin say earlier, they walked in a very well-practiced, eyes down, eyes forward, not looking at the former president, who was really just maybe a foot or two to their right as they have to file past him. And they got into the witness box. And then what I'll tell you is that from where we were sitting, David, we're not able to see his face. We can only see the back of his head. So it's hard to know what expression was on his face. But as they started to read through the counts, count 1, guilty, count 2, guilty, there was no motion at all in his body until they got to count 4, at which point he slowly started to shake his head. And that lasted for a few more counts. And then at around count 6 or 7, he was just still again, all the way through to count 34 when he was found guilty on all counts, David.
Any reaction were you able to see from Eric Trump, his son? Was his son still in the courtroom at that point?
His son, Eric, was in the courtroom sitting next to one of his attorneys, and no obvious reaction from him either. He was looking straight ahead, sort of ramrod straight, and did not betray any emotion. And then I will tell you, David, that when the jury did file out, it was that same awkward staging in the room that we've talked about so many times. They walked out now with him on their left. Some of the jurors actually turned their face to the right in the direction of the judge and away from the direction of Trump so that they would not have to make eye contact with him as they filed out of the room. And then when he left the room a few minutes after that, there was just a look of disgust. I have no other real word for it on his face as he walked out of the room, and then you saw him before the cameras after that.
We're looking at the SUV carrying the former president back up to Trump Tower here in Manhattan. And Josh, the moments after the verdict was delivered, we understand that each juror was then polled right there with the former president sitting at the defense table, each juror polled by the judge. And how did that play out? And I know you were sitting behind the president, very hard to tell his facial expression, but describe for me, if you will, that moment, and then what the judge then said to those jurors after their job was done.
So when the judge polled the jurors, he didn't poll them on each count. Of course, there are 34 counts, there are 12 jurors. He basically went through juror 1, is this your verdict? Juror 1 said yes, juror 2, juror 3. And during that time, Trump did turn in his chair and he was looking off in the direction of the jurors. No obvious expression on his face. It seemed fairly impassive. And then, at the end, the judge did thank these jurors for their service. He told them, I don't have a direct quote in front of me, but he told them how difficult this trial has been, how stressful this trial has been for them. He thanked them for their service and he excused them from the room. And then he asked them if it would be okay if after he excused them from the room, he would then go to them to have a conversation with them and thank them personally, one-on-one. And that was when they rose from the jury box. Everyone rose, including the former president, and then they filed out of the room, taking great pains not to look in his direction.
That's a very interesting observation, and I had wondered earlier when I had reported earlier on the air here that the judge told those jurors that he would be interested in their feedback, thanked them for what was a very difficult task, when that communication might take place between the jurors and the judge. Josh Einiger here of WABC reporting that the judge then planned on meeting with those jurors after they left the courtroom. And you have to wonder, Josh, and it's an impossible question to answer, you have to wonder if the foreperson or perhaps the two attorneys within the jury or who it was on that jury that got them all together and said, when we walk in, let's walk in a certain way, because your description and Olivia Rubin's description earlier on the air, really match up to a T. The decorum, the way they carried themselves, regardless of what you believe about this case, how they carry themselves is something that we can all observe and certainly appreciate, at least in their behavior. I know there are going to be a lot of opinions on the outcome of this trial, but to have walked in and to be concerted in their effort to sort of look down, not bring any more emotion or drama to a case that's already has historic implications here.
You know, David, it's hard to know, of course, as you point out, what the impetus was behind all of that. Part of it really could simply be that it was just uncomfortable for them. Here they are in this incredibly weighty position. The fate of the former leader of the free world is in their hands. And he's a pretty imposing figure, especially when he stands. So part of it could simply be that, kind of intimidation factor, or maybe an attempt not to allow themselves to be intimidated by that, type of stature, standing, that presence just to their right as they walk in or their left as they walk out. It was, though, as you point out, David, I mean, there were 2 attorneys on this jury. There were quite a few people with advanced degrees. So, there are people with life experience and wisdom, perhaps, who could guide, the whole jury in terms of how it comports itself during this really historic and very stressful trial.
Josh Einiger of WABC TV. Josh is just one of several reporters who've been down there from the beginning for us, both through WABC and our network team here, there with Olivia Rubin and Aaron Kotursky. And we'll come back to each of them with our live coverage here. Again, you're watching ABC News live coverage. The former president being brought back uptown to Trump Tower in a city where 12 jurors have found him guilty on all 34 felony counts against him. It had been believed, as we were in day 2 of deliberations, the fact that the deliberations continued throughout today, they got close to that end time today. There had been some indication from the judge that the day would be wrapping up. Jurors might be going home. There was levity at the defense table between the former president and Todd Blanche, his lead defense attorney. They thought they were going home for the day. When suddenly the judge said that jury has reached a verdict and they will be entering the courtroom shortly. A number of our reporters who were in the courtroom and in that overflow room that actually has a camera trained on the courtroom as well, all described very similarly the change in temperature immediately at that defense table. We had been reporting here over the last day or two that with every day that goes on, that gives a defense team a little more hope that there might be dissent among jurors within the jury. And that doesn't mean they're not still going to come up with the same answer, but as the days wear on, that's considered a better sign perhaps for the defense. And so that sudden turn at the end of today, Dan, must have been very unsettling for the former president and for Todd Blanche.
Yeah, I mean, look, a hung jury in this case, meaning one juror saying I'm not going to convict, would have been a big victory for Donald Trump. It would have meant any potential retrial wouldn't happen until after the election. If he wins the election, it wouldn't happen potentially until 2029. So they were certainly hoping at the least for a hung jury here. And I'll tell you, the fact that this jury came back today is pretty quick. I mean, yes, you can argue this wasn't that complicated a case. That's true. As a legal matter, though, it wasn't that easy a case either. And the fact that these jurors came back after a half day yesterday, a day of deliberations today, came back with a verdict in this kind of case suggests to me that there wasn't much dissent on that jury. Because it'll be very interesting to hear when they initially went back there. Did they poll the jury? Did they say, what are you all thinking? Let's do a quick hand raise. A lot of the time that happens in the jury room. Were they all saying that they thought guilty at the outset? Again, this was a pretty quick verdict to come back with 34 counts and suggest to me that if there was any dissent, there wasn't much.
Let's ask you a couple of quick legal questions for those who might have just joined us right around the 6 o'clock hour here in the East when people come to the TV for their local news. You're stuck with us a little earlier than normal here tonight, given the stakes at play here and this guilty verdict for former President Trump, guilty on all 34 counts. This does nothing, Dan, legally when it comes to running for president. He continues to run, no problem.
Correct, and he can vote, too. We were about to talk about it before. He can run for president, no question. The question of voting is based on New York state law because Florida defers back to the state where it happened. That's New York. In New York, really the only way you can't vote is if you're serving time, actually serving time. So he will be able to run for president and he'll be able to vote. The question's going to be when the sentencing is going to happen on July 11th. The question is going to be, even at that sentencing, whatever the sentence is, does it begin immediately? I think that there's a really serious chance that what will happen is that the judge will say, I'll allow you to appeal this, And while they're appealing, the sentence, whatever it is, would be put on hold.
This might be a little nuanced, but I find it interesting in all the reading because he has moved to Florida and made himself a resident of Florida. That's his home base now. That had the trial played out in Florida, for example, he would not be able to vote. Felons in Florida aren't able to vote.
Right. It would be a different law. It would be under Florida law. But again, Ron DeSantis could change that, right? As the governor, he could say, I'm going to pardon you, in effect, and allow him then to vote. So if it had been in Florida, Ron DeSantis, as the governor, would have control over not just the question of can he vote, but he could also pardon him with regard to any conviction as well.
But of course, it's a moot point because even though he's a resident of Florida, they won't have to do anything to help allow him to vote.
Correct.
Because this played out in New York, where they would allow a convicted felon to vote unless they're serving time. Now, this is the question that came up earlier, and it is a question that people at home are going to ask. We know the sentencing is July 11th. By my count, 4 days before the Republican National Convention. It's still extremely unlikely that the sentencing would include any kind of time behind bars.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unlikely. You're talking about the lowest level felony here. You're talking about someone with no criminal record. One question I think some people will ask is, well, you know, this is a defendant who has been attacking and trashing this judge. Even we just heard him do it moments ago. Could that play into the sentencing? Typically in a case, a lawyer would say, are you crazy? You're going after the judge who has complete and total discretion over what your sentence is going to be? I think this case is a little different. I think there's more of an expectation of the politics meets law aspect of attacking the judge. Question is, how will the judge react to that? Because he does have the discretion. We're talking about what would usually happen in a case like this. The judge could still decide that he wants prison time, but I think in the end that remains unlikely, even despite the very significant and personal attacks on this judge.
What do you think he does, the judge?
I think he's going to give him some sort of probation, maybe some sort of community service. There's a possibility of home confinement, which would be sort of a balance between the two.
We're watching the Secret Service here. They have arrived at Trump Tower, just south of Central Park, for those of you who know Manhattan. The former president returning to his home at Trump Tower. You can see the NYPD there telling people to continue on their way. Difficult thing, though, to get through to New Yorkers who know very well, obviously, as does the country, that this is something that certainly will divide many Americans, but it will be a day and a piece of history that we will not forget in a long line of sort of markers in this political climate of these last several years in our country. Former President Trump, you see here, arriving back at Trump Tower just a couple of hours after thinking that the jury would be going home for another night, that deliberations would go into a third day, and then the sudden turn in that courtroom when Judge Juan Merchan informed the former president, where you saw him there just moments ago on the sidewalk. Unclear whether or not he will address any reporters or those who are gathered there. Let's just listen to those who are gathered there on Fifth Avenue. Familiar gestures from the former president, though no words, a sort of rarity from the former president, and it's hard to decipher the differing chants. What we're hearing from folks there, though, those on the ground will be able to report that out later. One thing we did take note of over the course of this trial is that the crowds gathered in Lower Manhattan were small by comparison of what we have seen by way of rallies in the past or gatherings in support of or against the former president. And John Santucci, I want to bring you in on that. The fact that what we witnessed in Lower Manhattan over the last couple of weeks, there wasn't large-scale protesting outside that courthouse. I want you to weigh in on that, and also you have a reaction from Stormy Daniels just in.
Yeah, David, a couple of things. First, if I could, David, just an observation from what we just saw of Donald Trump walking up in front of the building. David, I remember it almost like deja vu, and it's funny because it's so critical to what came up in this trial. the weekend that the Access Hollywood tape came out in October of 2016. That image that we just saw, David, is a rinse and repeat of what Donald Trump did the Saturday morning as he was hunkered down in Trump Tower, plotting what to do for his first run for the White House. He came outside the tower, he pumped his fist on the corner of 56th Street, looked around for a second, and walked back in. It is literally copy and paste what the former president did as a candidate under intense pressure, under what was at that point, David, the worst moment for his first campaign for the White House. And just to see that again as someone that has covered Donald Trump for that long, from that moment, it really is just an unbelievable image to see again a day after another one that was so horrible for him, to see him doing that exact thing. I mean, Donald Trump has a playbook. We know that. He talks about every day of his life being an episode of a TV show. It clearly seems like that one was a bit of a rerun, if you will. But just to go back to your other question, David, about reaction from many people around the former president, I've gotten a lot of texts in the last couple of moments here. Not surprised, angry, trying to find a way to pivot towards a way to get this campaign back on track. And really move away from this courthouse. Donald Trump is probably tonight going to spend one of his last nights in Manhattan, and then it's back to Florida, where he is a resident now, and then quickly back on the campaign trail. David, just to your other question about Stormy Daniels, our colleague Olivia Rubin, who ran out of that courtroom and spoke to us, and then quickly got reaction from Stormy Daniels' attorney. Her attorney telling Olivia in a statement, quote, "Stormy is relieved that this case is now over. She always had great faith in our justice system and the solemn oath jurors take in undertaking their service. No man is above the law, and the selfless, hardworking service of each of these jurors should be respected and appreciated." David, that is an attorney for Stormy Daniels to our colleague Olivia Rubin here at ABC News. And you got to imagine, David, for tonight, going back to Donald Trump, if I can for a second, now that he is going back into that tower, back into that residence, he's going to be doing, David, what he did for so often when he would come home from the campaign trail. He's going to have cable TV on all night. He's going to be watching all of the coverage. He'll probably be watching us very shortly. We know that he still watches all of the evening newscasts on TiVo. He says it was one of the greatest inventions ever. And he'll be focusing on all of the commentary, taking this in. He'll start doing what he always does, working the phones, asking people, what do they think about this? It is going to be very hard for people to tell him much of this is good, because as we've talked about repeatedly, and you mentioned this earlier, David, and it's a great point and an important one, Donald Trump is obsessed with two sets of numbers. Ratings, he was always focused on TV ratings, and poll numbers. And we know that those polling numbers that have shown that if there was a conviction in this case, it could impact a small but important swath of voters. That is something he's going to be asking people when he starts doing the phone calls tonight. How many voters do you think? Could this be a problem?
I want to bring in Rachel Scott, who covers the race for president, on that point. John, thank you. Stick with us here. Rachel, just looking at these numbers here, the latest ABC News Ipsos poll, 20% of Donald Trump supporters said they would reconsider or withdraw their support for him if he were convicted in the New York case. Now, of course, it's still early on. The numbers in these polls have showed, considerable movement back and forth, but within a range, which I always find fascinating this far out. This race is very close in this country. It's very close in the key battlegrounds, which we all know. The Electoral College is what decides these presidential races. But inside the campaign, they have got to be concerned about the potential if these numbers hold, because 20% of supporters who might reconsider changing who they would vote for could be just enough to make the difference in an election that's 1 or 2 points, at least nationally.
David, over the last several weeks, there are advisors in the Trump campaign, allies to the former president, who have simply just been concerned about the image of having the former president, a presumptive Republican nominee, inside of the courtroom. Now, the former president walking into Trump Tower, he was followed behind him with several campaign aides. They're going to walk into that building and have to contend with something that no other campaign has ever had to face in American history. And that is how to have a presumptive Republican nominee who is also a convicted felon now try to get to the White House. We have seen the former president bounce from the campaign trail back to the trial and the courtroom back to the campaign trail. And his advisors are in fact worried, as is the former president, as we know, that he keenly follows many of these poll numbers, how much of a political liability this is going to be for him, not only within his own base. We know, according to our ABC News Ipsos poll, that 80% of Trump supporters say they will stick with him, but it's that 20% who say they'll either reconsider or withdraw their support. And even when you look at other polls, 17% of independents in a latest Quinnipiac poll said that they might be less likely to vote for the former president if he's convicted of a crime. That is a big concern for the former president, because we know just how close this race could be. So even just having a small swath of those voters turn away from the former president could make all the difference in these critical battleground states. One group that is not turning away from him, David, I will tell you, it is the Republican Party. They have lined up one by one behind the former president. We're already seeing that reflected in the number of statements that we received since the verdict was actually reached and read inside of that Manhattan courthouse. And not only that, we saw something too that was pretty unprecedented, David. We saw a number of Republicans line up behind the former president at that Manhattan courthouse, including the second in line to the presidency, the Speaker of the House, David. They are standing by him as he goes through this.
You talk about the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and as you know, he was in that courtroom. In recent days, there has been, Johnson Tucci alluded to this earlier, a sort of tally of who showed up in that courtroom to show their political support of Donald Trump, who within the Republican Party, Speaker Johnson among them. And we know that politically up on the Hill, Speaker Johnson has tried to move forward certain issues that Donald Trump was putting pressure on Republicans not to move forward with. But on this particular point, they sort of cleared the deck. Speaker Johnson, in a show of political unity, showed up at that courthouse here in New York.
Yeah, and David, how rare is it to see the second in line to the presidency show up outside of a courthouse to defend a former president who was standing trial, who has just been convicted on felony counts? It was an extraordinary part that we have never seen before in American history. We've heard from the Speaker of the House today. He calls this a shameful day in American history. And of course, it wasn't just the Speaker of the House. There were 37 Republican officials that visited that Manhattan courthouse. We were talking about 2 Republican governors, 7 current or former attorney generals, 28 Republican lawmakers, and a lot of them were saying what the former president could not. We know that Donald Trump was under that very strict gag order, so a lot of those Republicans were coming out in a show of loyalty for the former president to rail against Michael Cohen, to rail against the witnesses, to blast this whole process, something that the former president was barred from doing under that gag order. It was a sign of loyalty to the former president. But David, this is a party that has only grown more closer to Donald Trump as he has been indicted and now as he has been convicted.
We have learned moments ago the Trump campaign says that their fundraising site is down because of the volume of people, supporters looking to show in sizable numbers, according to the Trump campaign, their support of the former president. And the former president posting himself, Rachel, on Truth Social.
Yeah, just moments ago, as the former president was making his way there to Trump Tower, he did post on Truth Social. He called this a disgrace. He claims that he is innocent. He says, "We'll keep fighting. We'll fight to the end," ending that statement by saying the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And it certainly will, David. It will certainly be up to the people of the United States to decide whether or not they want to put former President Donald Trump back in the White House.
Rachel Scott, our thanks to you as well this afternoon. Of course, these polls don't indicate that if they change their mind on Donald Trump because of the conviction, that they would necessarily vote for President Biden instead. But certainly a question moving forward in the polling will be whether or not certain voters in this country can stomach, if you will, voting for a convicted felon, and for those whom it makes no difference at all. That's going to be a question certainly asked to voters with greater intensity now that it is a reality. 34 felony counts late this afternoon here in New York. The former president found guilty on all counts in the hush money case involving the payment to Stormy Daniels, that payment made by Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's, handpicked for many years, fixer and lawyer. Cohen testifying that he took out a home equity loan to pay Stormy Daniels, and prosecution made the case that it was not just Michael Cohen here, that this was a concerted effort along with David Pecker, former publisher at the National Enquirer, to try to catch and kill, if you will, certain stories that might be damaging to then President Trump's as a candidate campaign leading up to the 2016 election. Again, as we know from jury instructions from Judge Juan Merchan here in New York, he told them repeatedly that they could not convict based solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen, that they must look at the totality of the evidence here. 6:27 here in the East. World News Tonight coming up in just moments. Our entire team standing by. These are images just moments ago, Fifth Avenue. The former president making familiar gestures that we have seen politically for many years now to the crowd gathered. The chants from the crowd, people chanting, most likely, if it's New York City, and we know New York well, with both viewpoints. And certainly we heard and saw that downtown, although the size and scope of the crowd downtown was much smaller than what we have seen along the way, certainly at political rallies and other moments of support or demonstrations against, really at both kinds of demonstrations. What we saw at the courthouse in Lower Manhattan wasn't what we have seen certainly in recent years. Dan Abrams, a final thought from you as Judge Juan Merchan, as you say, will rely on suggestions from a probation officer, sort of extraordinary to wrap your head around this, that the former president of the United States, like any other convicted felon, will have to sit across from a probation officer, be asked several questions, and then that officer will suggest to Judge Merchan where to go from there.
Right. The probation department will make a recommendation. But I think in this case, the judge is going to kind of do this one on his own. Yeah. In a typical case, you need some advice from the probation department. You need to interview. You need to learn about the defendant. They provide a whole list of information, et cetera, about the person. That's supposed to help inform the judge's sentence. Here, the judge knows a lot about Donald Trump. I'm not sure he's going to need a lot of assistance from the probation department. Not sure that he's going to rely one way or the other on that. But there's a huge range here of possibilities in terms of a sentence. You're talking about anything from no jail time at all to up to 4 years in prison. No one expects anything like the top end. The question really just becomes any jail time at all. And as you and I have talked about repeatedly, I think that's unlikely.
And it's not 4 years for each felony count. It's 4 years over the course of all these counts.
Right. I mean,
it's concurrent.
It could, in theory, be 4 years, but it's not.
Yeah, that's just
correct. That's not a practical reality in this case, based on these particular crimes.
We will wait to see. And as you suggest, I certainly believe that is the case. Judge Juan Merchan certainly will be likely coming up with whatever decision he comes up with, mostly on his own. And he's had some time to think about this, certainly the potential that he would have to come up with a sentence for a former president of the United States who late today was found guilty on 34 felony counts in a New York courtroom. Again, the former president, Donald Trump, back at Trump Tower tonight, deciding what his next move will be as he continues in this race for president. World News Tonight begins right now.
This has been a special report from ABC News.